Good evening. I hope you're having a wonderful Sunday afternoon. Certainly a change in the weather going on out there today, maybe in the 50s with the sun shining bright and pretty. Every day is a blessing, though, if we think about it in that way. I want to thank you for tuning in with us, and hopefully you were able to join us online this morning and to get your worship into God today. And just keep in mind, if you missed that, you are able to go back. That recording should still be on Facebook, and you should be able to still do that and to share that with your friends and family and things like that. The Faith and Works class, we went ahead and made the decision to hold off till a week from Tuesday before we go back into full force. So I believe that's March the 2nd, but that's a week from Tuesday. But we do hope to be back in person, Lord willing, and nothing strange happens before then on Wednesday evening. So Wednesday evening services, we should be back in action. So keep that in mind, and of course it'll be streamed if at all possible as well. So those options are available to you coming up. Now, as far as the devotional thought for this evening goes, I'm wondering, I bet just about every one of you have heard someone give a prayer, and at that prayer they say something about we're praying or we're hoping that to hear you say at the end of this life, well done, good and faithful servant. Now, they're taking that, if you think about where you hear that in the Bible, it's in Matthew chapter 25, when Jesus was giving us the parable of the talents, and he said, well done, good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of the Lord. And of course, that entering into the joy of the Lord is what we want to be looking for. Now, I want us to think about that saying. We hear that, but do we really think about it? That's what we want to have God to say to us when we get to His presence and when we face the judgment. We want to have Him say, well done, good and faithful servant. Well, if you want to be a good and faithful servant, you have to be a servant. Now, if you did catch the sermon this morning, you know that one of the verses that I talked about was Matthew chapter 9, verses 34 and 35, where Jesus was instructing the disciples that the person who is first will be last, and he will be servant of all. So God is going to bring forward in the next life the ones that have been servants in this life. Now, all this, you think about how all these things tie together. In Isaiah chapter 52, around verse 13 or so through chapter 53, verse 12 or so, Jesus is pictured as a suffering servant. And then when he came to this world and he lived this life, he lived his life serving other men. He lived his life in service to the plan of God the Father. And you think about how hard that plan was to carry through. You think about the power that Christ could have had, gave up the joy of heaven to come here to be mocked, to be rejected, to be beaten, spit on, nailed to a cross, and then mocked some more, the side pierced, and all those things that he had to go through. He came here to serve men. In fact, he made this clear really in John chapter 13. I think most of us are probably familiar. If we've done much Bible study at all, we're familiar of the passage where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. One thing that always pops into my mind is Peter saying, you're not going to wash my feet, Lord. And Jesus said to him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. Now, the purpose behind all of this that we find out in verse, or to the end of those verses, is that the reason for this is he was teaching them how to be a servant. He was doing this as an example to them of how they should live their lives. It was nothing to do with the feet washing. Was just a mode that he used to teach this lesson. I don't believe for a minute that it was specifically tied to that. Is that the only way that we're to be a servant? Because if that's what we read into it, then that's what we need to think. I don't think that's the case at all. We are to be a servant in that we put God first and our fellow man second. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, the greatest commandment, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, we're familiar with that passage, but I wonder how many of us have really thought about some things to do with, well, if you look back, if you happen to be looking at John chapter 13, and you look at your Bibles at verse 2, this is pretty striking. The devil had already put it in the heart of Judas to betray Jesus. Now I want you to think about that for just a minute. So not only did he wash the disciples' feet, but Jesus was washing the dirty feet of a traitor when he washed the feet of Judas. Now, is there anyone that's ever lived that's shown us a better example of how to be a servant? Let me ask you, could you wash the feet of a traitor? Could you love your enemy enough that you would want him to be saved? Could you love your enemy enough to bow down, to be his servant, to teach him a lesson in salvation? If we can't serve our fellow man, then I don't know how we can be a servant to God. And I think that's a lot of the point behind all of this. God gives us these things to do, lessons to be learned, and we serve each other. And in doing so, we learn how to serve God, and we learn how to be more like God. Now, as with other things that Jesus did, he's left us the perfect example. Being willing to come here to die on that cross, to wash the feet of a traitor, everything that he did was a perfect example, and he's given us the perfect example of how to be a servant. Now, if you really want God to say to you in that last day when you face the judgment, "Well done, good and faithful servant," then it seems to me like we're going to have to get busy on being a servant. If we want to be better Christians, then we should be more focused on serving rather than being served. You know, God's pretty smart. And if you want to be a better Christian and you want this world to be a better place, focus on serving your fellow man rather than yourself. And I think you'll be going a long way toward doing your part in being like Christ and making this world a better place. I just want to thank you once again for tuning in, and I pray that you all have a blessed week.